Alright, so in this video, we're going to learn how to spot a film from music, and how to use the spotting process to find an appropriate musical tempo for a given scene. Spotting is the process of finding out when and where the music should start, stop, and develop throughout a film. Typically, spotting is something you would do with the director of a project, but when starting out, you might not always get to work with the director, so it's very important to understand how to do this on your own. So with that, let's get started. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is actually open the film in your DAW of choice. Here I've got the short film we've been using throughout this series loaded in Cubase, and I'm going to focus on spotting scene number 3, which takes place inside of the freak tent. So in my spotting notes, I've already included my name for the scene, as well as the SMPTE in and SMPTE out codes for when it starts and ends, all of which I was able to just copy and paste from my scene list that we made earlier in this series. Now, step number 1 for spotting is to identify each of our potential hit points. And a hit point is just any moment in the scene where a shift in the story matches a shift in the music. And essentially, these are the moments in the scene where it will sound most natural for the music to kind of enter, to exit, or even to just kind of shift somewhat dramatically, like changing instruments, changing styles, swapping to a new melodic idea, stuff like that. Now, the trick to identifying these hit points is to look for moments where the contour of the scene shifts. These are moments where the audience is going to experience kind of a shift in emotional experience, a shift in their energy level, or when they're given new information that propels the story forward. Now, I'm going to go through this scene and figure out just where these moments take place. And as I do, I'm going to use a marker track in Cubase to just kind of leave a little flag for me to reference later. Now, since I'm not technically supposed to be sharing any footage from this film just yet, I am going to speed through this section and then explain my decisions afterward. So I ended up finding about 4 potential hit points for this scene. And something important to note is that these 4 hit points aren't necessarily standard. I'm sure another composer or director could easily find a few more or a few less to focus on. But that's what makes this an art form and not exactly a science. I'm sure that I'll go through and change these a little bit myself later on. But when spotting a film, as long as you can justify your decisions using at least one of the 3 categories for contour shifts, then you should be good. Just as a kind of rule of thumb, it does tend to be a bit better to err on the side of fewer hit points than too many. So in my spotting notes, I've included the SMPTE code for each potential hit point under the category of contour. These moments were the very start of the scene, when Unicorn Boy rolls his eyes at a rude couple, when the camera cuts to a close-up of the mother character, and then finally when Unicorn Boy seems to recognize her. While I don't typically include this in my notes, I have included my justifications for each hit point here on the screen for you to see. Now that I have my potential hit points mapped out, I can start treating them each as kind of starting a new section of the scene, and begin thinking about their unique technical and musical needs. So first, I need to figure out how prominent the music needs to be for each section. I can start by describing the dialogue. How much is there? Does it continue through the whole section? Are there places where it starts or stops? Is there no dialogue? All you need to do is just jot down any information you think is important to be aware of. In this scene, there wasn't really a lot of dialogue, so I just took notes on prominent lines being spoken in each section. Next, I want to take a note on any sound effects. Specifically, are there any important sound effects? These would be any noises that come as unexpected, like a sudden clap of thunder, or that provide information to the audience on what is happening off screen, sort of like the sound of a door being opened in another room. Alternatively, maybe there's just a lot of noise that you want to be aware of as you write the music. Again, just take notes on anything you think is important. Nothing really stood out in this scene, so I just made a few notes on what I heard. Finally, we can take notes on whether or not the music needs to be in the sonic foreground or background of this scene. As a general rule of thumb, if there is any dialogue or important sound effects, then the music needs to stay in the background. If neither of those elements are present, then you can feel free to push it forward a little more. Having space in the sonic foreground means that you can get a little more adventurous and bold with your music, without having to worry about distracting the audience from the story. Since this scene doesn't have any dialogue or any important sound effects, it's a great opportunity to work with more melodic and intricate musical material. The one exception being in section 2 of the scene, where we have a little bit of a short line being spoken by a character in the story that we don't want to cover up with music. In other situations, this might also be where I would take notes on which hit points I want to use to start or stop the music, or even just specific sections where I don't want any music in the first place. However, for each of the sections where I do want to write music, there are a few more notes I can take to kind of help plan things out. Specifically, I can take notes on the energy level, emotions, compositional structure, and forms or themes that I want to try to use during each section. These notes will help take some of the guesswork out of my writing and give me a more reliable foundation to work with while scoring the scene. All right, so with all of that taken care of, the last thing we want to do is to start experimenting with different tempos that could work with this scene as a whole. Fortunately, this isn't nearly as complicated as it may seem. So first things first, I want to just make sure that my hit point markers are locked to their respective time codes so that they don't get moved around when I start changing the tempo map. Then I'm going to switch my view from time code to bars and beats, and then I'm just going to add a quick tempo track. I'm just going to take a quick look to make sure that there's a marker at the beginning of the scene, which there is. And yeah, now I am ready to start adjusting the tempo. The trick here is to look at where each of your hit points actually land in your music. Typically, you want each hit point to occur on the very first beat of a measure. If this isn't possible, then simply placing them on a strong beat in your time signature is a good backup, and really just kind of getting them on any beat at all is kind of the bare minimum that you want to work with. So with these goals in mind, you kind of want to start thinking about the music you plan to write and how many measures you'll need to work with. Most themes tend to consist of either 4 or 8 bar phrases, so working with this number is typically a good starting point. So in the last video, I already started sketching out my themes for this project a little bit, and most of them are sticking around the 60 BPM markers, so I'll start by selecting that tempo to work with. All right, and this actually works pretty well. Right off the bat, I can see that hit point 2 is just a little off bar 11. Now, when I started planning my themes, I thought that the primary melody or invitation theme for this film should play at the start of this particular scene specifically. And that theme's an 8-bar theme, so if I include a 2-bar intro before starting the theme, then it should end perfectly at measure 11 and be ready to start moving on to a new idea or get developed in some way. So I'm actually going to try, and I'm going to use this tool up here, which is the tempo tool. I'm going to click on measure 11. I'm going to zoom in with my mouse, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to drag it so that measure 11 starts right at the second hit point. So from here, it's just going to be a simple matter of taking the other hit points and making small adjustments. We'll make sure that's on beat 4 to make sure it all kind of just lines up with each of our hit points at important beats. So this is going to result in a few tiny tempo changes throughout the scene, but they're all going to stick pretty close to 60 beats per minute. And little subtle changes like this aren't really that big of an issue when using sound libraries. And as long as you don't get too crazy, they shouldn't be an issue for studio musicians either, since they'll likely have a click track or a metronome that they get to work with while recording the music. Now, I typically like to spend a lot more time playing around with this. I'll usually kind of experiment with different hit points and different tempi while I'm writing the actual music, which means that my final product will probably look a little different than what I've got here. But I will likely remain pretty faithful to these initial ideas. And especially any tempo decisions I make will focus on making sure each of my hit points land on some kind of beat. Like I said earlier, preferably right on beat 1 of a measure, or at least on a strong beat, or at the very least on a beat, like this little hit marker 3, which goes on beat 4 of a measure. Using this strategy, you can typically find a pretty reliable tempo that can be used throughout a piece, or at least a few reliable tempo changes that could be feasible to work with. So with that, we have reached the end of another video. I want to take a quick moment to thank my incredible patrons for making videos like this one possible. This week, a special shout out goes to my newest patrons, Sage, Anthony, and Frank. I appreciate the support I'm getting from each of you, and I'm glad to have you all on the team. If you would like to show your support for this channel, the links for private lessons, purchasing a copy of my book, and to my Patreon page are all in the description of this video. So until next time, keep studying, keep working hard, and keep writing new music.